It is almost dark at the edge of the quarter, and there is still one more piece of work to do. Not the master's work. That is finished or finished enough. This is the other work, the work that belongs to nobody but the family doing it. A woman kneels at the end of a row with a child beside her, and her hands, black hands that have been moving since before the sun came up, press seed into soft dirt in the last of the light. Okra, field peas, a little patch of greens that will feed them when the greens are all they have. Behind the cabin, sweet potatoes are coming up in a hill of turned earth. This garden is small. You could walk the whole of it in under a minute. But in every way that matters, it belongs to them. And there is almost nothing else in their entire lives they can say that about. Sit with that garden for a second, because it is easy to miss what it really is. It looks like extra work at the end of an impossible day. It looks like making do. But that patch of ground is a quiet act of defiance. And the people who own that land knew it because they had done everything they could think of to make sure that garden was never needed. They measured out just enough food to keep a body working and never enough to let a family stand on its own. They wanted the dependence. They built it on purpose, and a garden planted after dark by hands that had every reason to be too tired was the beginning of the answer to it. So here is the question this whole story turns on. Why did feeding yourself frighten them so much? Why did a peck of cornmeal and a few pounds of fatback come wrapped in so many rules about what you could grow and hunt and keep? What were the foods that no code and no overseer could ever quite take away? Stay with me, because the answer is not a recipe. The answer is one of the reasons your people are still here. Start with the thing that was handed to you, because everything else in this story is an answer to it. On many plantations, the food came out once a week, and it barely changed from one week to the next. A peck of cornmeal, 3 or 4 pounds of salt pork or fatback, sometimes a little molasses. That was the ration, written down in a ledger in the owner's own hand, the same page, the same steady columns where you would write down, "Feed for the mules." And it was not an accident that it was thin. It was thin on purpose. The ration was a leash. It was measured out not to nourish, but to keep you needing the next handout. Because a family that has to be fed cannot easily afford to say no. Hunger is a kind of obedience. Keep a person just fed enough to work, and just afraid enough of losing the little they get, and you have a worker who will not run, because to run is to starve. That was the whole design. So when people said their family grew too strong to be broken, understand that they were never talking about muscle. They were talking about this exact thing. Too strong meant fed by your own hands. Too strong meant free enough to say no. So this is the shape of what is coming. First, the leash, the ration, and what it was really built to do. Then the second table, the food a family grew and caught and kept for itself. The table the master did not plant and could not fully control. And then the thing underneath all of it, the reason a garden and a fishing line and a jar of put-up beans could frighten powerful men. Every turn of this is real history, and I'm going to show you the record standing behind it. Not a guess, because that is the promise this channel runs on, and I am not going to break it for a good story. This is not nostalgia. It is the record. When I tell you what the ration was, that comes from the plantation account books where the weekly allowance was written down in plain ink. When I tell you families grew and sold their own food, that comes from historians who spent their lives inside those archives. The culinary historian Michael Twitty has traced these foodways plant by plant and dish by dish. Adrian Miller has written the history of soul food and of black barbecue. From the sources up. The food historian Jessica B. Harris has followed this cooking across the whole diaspora, from the coast of West Africa to the American South. And the geographer Judith Carney documented how West African rice knowledge built one of the greatest fortunes in the American colonies, a story you are going to hear in full before we are done. And I am going to be just as straight with you about where the record runs thin, because you deserve that too. Some of what we carry is documented down to the ledger line. Some of it is tradition, passed mouth to mouth for generations because nobody with power ever bothered to write it down. One of the most beautiful pieces of it, the story of seeds braided into hair across the ocean, lives in that second place. I am going to tell you that story. I am also going to tell you plainly that it is tradition more than settled fact. The reason I say that out loud is simple. You deserve a narrator who knows the difference and who respects you enough to mark the line where it falls. The story is emotional. Every fact holding it up can be checked. So let me walk you through that second table, one part at a time, because this is the heart of it. And before I do, I want to name something that runs underneath every part of it, something you are going to feel building as we go. The knowing that made this table how to read a stand of woods, what to put up before the first frost, how to turn a scrap of ground and a fistful of seed into a whole winter of food, is not written down in most books. It lives in people. And when the last people who carry it go into the ground, it goes down with them. Unless somebody keeps it. That is the whole reason the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection exists. It is not a store, it is a place to keep the growing, the foraging, and the preserving this video is about. Gathered up before it disappears, so that the way your grandmother made something out of almost nothing does not have to be reinvented from scratch by people who never got to stand in the kitchen and watch her do it. If that is knowledge you want kept in one place, the link is in the description. Now, back to the table and the first thing sitting on it, which is the leash itself. Picture that ration one more time, because everything else balances on it. Once a week, the cornmeal and the fatback came out, and the sameness was the point. The same meal, the same fat, week after week, season after season, year after year. It was enough to swing a hoe and cut cane and pick cotton from first light to full dark. And it was very carefully not enough to do anything more. It gave you the strength to make another man rich and left you nothing to build a life of your own with. And here is the cruelty that hides inside a tidy ledger. Cornmeal and salt pork will keep a body moving, but they will not keep a body well. Enslaved people knew a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with an empty stomach, the slow hunger of eating the same poor food until the body begins to fail in ways nobody could name at the time. What they were handed was built to make them producers and keep them dependents at the very same moment. You worked, you were fed just enough to work again, and the circle closed behind you every single week. And the ledger did not stop at the grown workers. The allowance was handed out by what your body could produce. So the very young and the very old, the people who could not put in a full day in the field, were often given even less. A child was fed as an investment, not as a child. Read that back and let it land, because it tells you exactly how the food was being thought about. Not as nourishment for a person, but as fuel for a machine, dispensed at the lowest setting that would still turn the wheels. Cornbread and hoe cake and pot liquor, the water the greens were boiled in, saved because it carried the little goodness the meal otherwise lacked. That thin soup was not a quaint tradition. It was people wringing every scrap of nutrition out of a diet built to give them as little of it as possible, and paying for it in the slow diseases that come from a plate with everything fresh stripped off of it. So everything that comes next in this story is what people did to break that circle. Because a family that eats only what the master hands out is a family the master can starve into almost anything. And every single thing on that second table, the garden and the fish hook and the smokehouse and the root cellar, was a way of reaching past that weekly ration toward the one thing it was built to deny them: the ability to feed themselves, which is only another way of saying the ability to be free.
Before we continue, I want to show you something amazing. We put together a simple guide for the people who really care about these stories. Because whether we're talking about old school food, forgotten trade, one truth remains the same. History is disappearing. This is for anyone who believes these memories, these lessons, these ways of life are still worth keeping. You can find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here.
Now the garden, because that is where the reaching started. In the rice country of the Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, the labor was often organized around what was called the task system. You were assigned a task for the day, a fixed amount of work, and once it was finished, the rest of the daylight was, in a strange and narrow way, your own. That was not freedom. Nobody should hear this and think it was kindness. But it was time, real time, and people took that time and put it straight into the ground. Understand how rare that time was, because on most of the plantations across the South, there was no task system at all. There was the gang system, work in a driven line from dawn to dark with no end to it but nightfall, and no daylight left over for anything. The rice coast was the strange exception. The work of tending flooded rice fields lent itself to measured tasks, and once your task was done, the hours were yours in a way they were nowhere else. That is a big part of why the second table grew tallest right there in the Lowcountry, where enslaved families had just enough control over their own time to build something with it. And build they did. Historians who have gone through the records find enslaved people in these regions, keeping their own poultry and hogs, tending their own plots, trading and accumulating small property, running a whole internal economy in the margins of a system that said they could own nothing. It was small, it was fragile, but it was theirs. They worked provision grounds, garden plots near the quarters where a family grew what the ration would never give them. Okra and collard greens and field peas, sweet potatoes banked in low hills of earth behind the cabin, squash, cabbage, corn of their own. Picture black hands working a patch of red clay in the last hour of light. A whole family bent over rows that were theirs, coaxing color and variety in life into a diet that had been designed to stay gray. And here is the part that mattered most. They grew more than they could eat. That surplus is where the story turns, because it did not stop at the garden gate. On Sundays, in market towns like Charleston and Savannah, enslaved people carried what they had grown into town and sold it. Vegetables, eggs, baskets, small livestock. And they earned actual money, coins closing inside a hand that owned nothing else in the world, not even itself. There grew up right under the master's nose a small black economy that the master did not run and could barely even see. Think about what a garden and a market day gave a person who was supposed to own nothing. A little independence, measured out in coins and greens, that nobody had handed down to them and nobody could fully take back. That is a dangerous thing to give a person you are trying to keep. And the people who ran that world knew it. And think about what those coins could actually do, because this is where a garden becomes something more than food. A little money meant a person could choose a length of cloth to make something better than the rough allotment clothes, a pot, a tool, a small comfort for a child, seed for next year's garden, chosen and saved instead of begged for. In a life where nearly every decision was made for you by someone else, the ability to walk into a market on a Sunday and decide, with money you had earned, what your family would have was a taste of self-determination that the system was never supposed to allow. It was tiny. Set against everything that was stolen, it was almost nothing. But it was a door, and once a person has stood in a doorway and felt the air on the other side, they do not forget it. The master could take the crop, he could not take the memory of choosing. The garden fed them through the growing season, but a garden sleeps in winter, and a garden cannot give a family meat. So people turn to the woods and to the water, and this is where the law itself gets nervous. The slave codes, the actual written statutes that govern enslaved life in state after state, reached hard toward two things in particular. They tried to take the gun, and they tried to take the movement. In most places, it was a crime for an enslaved person to carry a firearm without express permission, and it was a crime to travel off the plantation without a written pass. Read those two rules side by side, and you can see plainly what the men who wrote them were afraid of. A person who can hunt and a person who can move is a person who can feed himself, and a person who can feed himself is a person who can one day leave. And we do not have to guess at that fear, because at least once the law spelled it out in black and white. In September of 1739, in South Carolina, enslaved people rose up in what became known as the Stono Rebellion, the largest uprising of enslaved people in the British mainland colonies. The response the next year was a sweeping new slave code. And look at what that code went after. It clamped down on movement and assembly, as you would expect. But it also reached for the economy, restricting the right of enslaved people to grow their own food for sale and to earn and keep their own money. Sit with that. When frightened men sat down to write a law to keep an enslaved population from ever rising again, one of the very first things they moved to shut off was a person's ability to feed and provide for themselves. They understood, better than almost anyone since, that a self-sufficient people is a people that is difficult to rule. The garden was not incidental to them. The garden was a target. But you cannot fence a forest, and you cannot drain a creek, and this is where people slipped the leash. They fed their families off the record in the exact places the law could not reach. They set traps for rabbit and possum and raccoon in the dark. They fished the rivers and the tidal creeks, often before dawn, pulling protein out of the water that never showed up in any ledger anywhere. And they foraged, reading the tree line the way you would read the shelves of a pantry. Wild greens of a dozen kinds, poke saleh, which you had to know to boil, and pour off and boil again, because that knowing was the whole difference between a meal and a poisoning. Berries, nuts, roots, mushrooms, all of it gathered by people who, by law, were never supposed to be out there touching it at all. And none of this was luck. This was skill, hard-won, and carefully passed down. And that matters, because skill is the thing a law cannot confiscate, knowing which greens filled the belly and which ones filled a grave. Knowing how to read the water for where the fish would hold, how to set a snare so a rabbit would find it, how to move through the dark woods quiet and find your way back before the horn blew at dawn. Knowing what the seasons were offering week by week, so that when the garden slept, there was still a tree line full of food for anyone who knew how to look. Older hands taught younger ones, out where the overseer could not hear the lesson, and the knowledge moved down the generations the way water finds its way downhill, quietly and without permission. Every child who learned to read the woods was a child who would be harder to starve for the rest of their life. Now hold what that actually meant. Every fish pulled from the creek and every rabbit lifted from a snare was a meal the master did not provide and could not account for. It was food the leash could not measure and could not cut off. A family that could read the woods was a family that was harder to starve, and a family that is harder to starve is a family that is harder to control, and harder to break, and harder to hold. The law understood this perfectly. That is exactly why it kept reaching for the gun and the pass. And it is exactly why, out in the tree line and down at the water before sunup, it kept failing. But some of what grew in those gardens did not begin in America at all. It came across the ocean in the holds of the slave ships carried inside the people themselves, in memory and in skill and, the tradition says, sometimes in seed. This is the part that turns a garden into an inheritance. So, slow down here with me. Look at what was actually growing in southern soil. Okra, from West Africa. Black-eyed peas, which are African cowpeas. Benne, which is sesame brought from the same coast. Sorghum, sometimes called guinea corn, African. Watermelon, African in origin. Yams, true yams, from West Africa, where the word and the food both begin. These were not southern crops that black families happened to take up. These were African crops that black families carried, planted, and kept alive in a new and hostile place on purpose so that a plate of food set down at the end of a brutal day could still taste like somewhere that was home. That is not making do. That is a people refusing to let a plantation decide what they were. And then there is rice, which is the largest story of all. Along the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, rice made men staggeringly, obscenely rich. So, ask the obvious question, where did the knowledge to grow it come from? Carney documented the answer, and it is not the answer the old histories like to tell. The tidal irrigation, the flooding and draining of the fields, the planting, the winnowing, the entire sophisticated craft of growing rice in standing water had been mastered in the rice regions of West Africa long before it ever reached America. The peoples stolen from those regions carried that expertise in their own hands and their own heads across the Atlantic. They flooded the fields, they worked the harvest, they built the fortune, and they never saw a single coin of the wealth they created. The rice written on the plantation ledger and the rice knowledge held in the enslaved workers' hands were the same rice. Only one of them ever got paid, and the knowledge went deeper than the field. Once the rice was harvested, it had to be milled, the tough outer hull knocked off each grain without shattering the grain inside, and that was a craft in itself. Enslaved workers did it by hand, with a tall wooden mortar and a heavy pestle, in a rhythm and a technique carried straight from West Africa. Then they winnowed it, tossing the grain into the air off a wide, flat, coiled basket so the wind could carry the chaff away. Those fanner baskets were African in design down to the weave, and their descendants are the sweetgrass baskets that Lowcountry artisans still coil by hand today, a living thread running unbroken from the rice fields to a craft table in Charleston right now. So when you look at a plate of Southern food, understand what you are really looking at. The okra in the gumbo, the field peas, the benne wafers, the rice at the center of the Lowcountry table. These are not borrowings, and they are not accidents. They are West Africa, kept alive on purpose by people who refused to let a plantation raise where they came from. The food remembered even when the record tried to forget. And there is a quiet act of sovereignty buried in that, one most people walk right past. Every one of those crops came back the next year only because someone saved the seed. You grow the okra, you eat most of it, and you set aside the best pods to dry. And those seeds are next spring's garden. Seed saving is how a people keep a crop alive across generations without asking anyone's permission. And it is how West Africa kept arriving in southern soil, spring after spring, long after the crossing. A family that saves its own seed is a family that does not have to be given anything to begin again. That is independence you can hold in the palm of your hand. Take watermelon. Since we are here, because its story is sharper than most people know. It is an African fruit carried across the same ocean as the people who knew it best. And after emancipation, free black farmers grew it and sold it and made something of themselves with it, a proud and profitable crop grown by free hands. It was partly in answer to that success, that visible black self-sufficiency, that watermelon got twisted into an ugly caricature meant to shame the very people who had mastered it. So understand what is happening when that stereotype gets used. It is the same old move in a new decade. Take a food that represented black independence and try to poison it because independence was always the thing that frightened them. The fruit did nothing wrong. The fruit is African, and it is yours, and it always was. There is one more piece here, and I promised at the start I would be honest about it, so here is the honesty. Tradition holds that some women, knowing they were being torn from everything they had ever known, braided seeds into their hair before the crossing, carrying a living piece of their homeland's food across the ocean on their own bodies. Whether every seed crossed in exactly that way, the record cannot prove, and you should be wary of anyone who tells you it can. But hold the image anyway, because the truth sitting underneath it is solid as stone. The knowledge crossed. The crops crossed. And they crossed inside people who were supposed to arrive with nothing at all, which means those people arrived carrying far more than the men who bought them ever understood. The last part of the second table is the one you cannot see from the road, because it lived underground and behind the cabin, in the food that was already put away. Growing food is one thing. Keeping food is another thing entirely, and keeping it is what carries a family through the months when nothing grows and the garden is bare dirt. So people preserved, they smoked meat in the smokehouse until it would hold. They salted and dried what the smoke did not touch. They pickled vegetables in stoneware crocks and set them by. They dug root cellars into the earth behind the cabins, cool dark rooms in the ground, where sweet potatoes and turnips and cabbages would keep through the cold. All of it was a way of reaching forward in time, of taking the abundance of a good season and spending it slowly, deliberately across a lean one. And each of those methods was its own body of knowledge, most of it carried by the women, most of it never written down anywhere. Curing meat meant knowing exactly how much salt, how long, how cold, so the meat would keep for months instead of turning. Smoking it meant knowing your wood and your fire and your time, the same patience that would one day become Southern barbecue. Sweet potatoes went into what people called a potato bank or a kiln, a mound of dirt and straw built up over the crops so it would hold through the cold without rotting, a technique you had to learn from someone who had already lost a harvest to doing it wrong. Muscadines and berries got put up. Beans got dried on the string and hung from the rafters. Cabbage went sour in the crock and kept for the winter. None of this was in cookbook. It was in a person, in a pair of hands that had done it enough times to know. And it passed from those hands to the next pair the same way the wood's knowledge did, quietly, out of sight, and utterly essential. And this is quieter than a hunt, and far less visible than a market day. But it may be the deepest independence of the whole table, because a family with a full root cellar and a smokehouse hung with meat is a family that does not have to beg in February. They control their own supply. They decide when they eat and how much they eat, instead of standing in line waiting on a weekly handout from a man who measured it out precisely to keep them needing him. Controlling your own pantry is controlling your own time. And controlling your own time is the very beginning of controlling your own fate. The people who put food by in the dark were storing something far bigger than sweet potatoes. They were storing the power to say no a little longer. So now put the whole table back together and look at it plainly, because this is the turn the entire video has been walking toward. The garden, the market coins, the fish, and the game, and the wild greens, the African seeds, the smokehouse and the cellar. Set them all side by side and ask the real question, why did any of this frighten the most powerful people in that world? These were vegetables, these were rabbits, and put up beans. Why write it into the law? Why reach for the gun and the pass and the rule against gathering? Here is why. Because none of this was ever really about the food. It was about what the food made possible. A family that grows its own greens, keeps its own smokehouse, reads its own woods, and holds its own money from a market day is a family that is harder to starve, harder to frighten, harder to break, and harder to hold. Self-sufficiency was, quietly and completely, the infrastructure of resistance. It was the full belly standing behind the person who finally ran. It was the endurance standing behind the person who refused. It was the reason a family could survive a bad master, a sold-off relative, a hungry winter, and still be standing, still be themselves, on the other side. Every seed pressed into the ground after dark was a small crack running through a system that depended absolutely on keeping people dependent. And this is not a metaphor. It is literal, and you can trace it. Think about what it actually took to run. Not just courage, and not just a direction. It took the ability to eat while you were out there, moving through country that wanted you caught, with no ration and no kitchen and no one to hand you a thing. The people most able to survive in the woods for days or weeks were the people who already knew the woods, who could forage a meal and pull a fish and read the land, because they had been feeding their families off that same land for years. The knowledge that put extra food on the cabin table was the exact same knowledge that could carry a person to freedom. And for those who could not run or would not leave family behind, whole communities of the escaped, the Maroons, survived for years in places like the Great Dismal Swamp precisely because they could grow, hunt, and forage their own food beyond the reach of any master. Self-sufficiency was not a nice side benefit of the second table. It was the engine underneath every act of resistance the enslaved South ever produced. The full belly came first. The freedom came after. And I want to be careful here, because this is where a lesser telling reaches for a cartoon villain, and the truth is both quieter and worse than that. The cruelty was not an accident or a personal failing here and there. It was structural. The whole arrangement ran on dependence, and so anything that fed independence, a hoe in the provision ground, a fish hook in the creek, a coin from the Sunday market, a jar of beans on the cellar shelf, was a threat to the arrangement itself. That is why the codes did not stop at the whip. They reached for the gun, the garden, the market, and the movement between them, because those were the tools of a family learning to feed itself. They were trying to close every door that led away from the ration, and they never managed to close them all. So let me bring this home, because there is a reframe here that I need you to actually hear. For too long, this story got told as a story of making do, of poor people scraping by on scraps and cleverness because they had no other choice. And there is a kind of quiet shame that can attach to that telling, as if resourcefulness were only a nicer word for deprivation. Let me say this as directly as I know how. There was never anything to be ashamed of in making a way. That making was genius. It was defiance. It was people outthinking a system built by the entire weight of the law to hold them down and beating it in a garden, in the dark, with their hands. Because the thing they could never take was never any single food. It was not the okra or the rice or the greens. It was the knowing how to feed a whole family from a scrap of ground, and the edge of the woods, and a handful of seeds that still remembered Africa. That knowing is the inheritance, and it is the one kind of wealth that cannot be seized or sold at auction or written out of a will or burned. It can only be passed down or forgotten. It outlived every single person who tried to bury it. It is very likely the reason you are here to hear this at all. And whether it keeps living now depends entirely on whether it gets handed forward or allowed to go quiet. Which is exactly why this next part matters, and it is the last time I will bring it up. If you want that knowing kept safe, the growing and the foraging and the preserving, the whole art of making a way from almost nothing gathered in one place so it does not go into the ground with the generation that mastered it, that is what the Grandma Made Away Kitchen Collection is for. Not as a purchase, as a way of keeping. The link is in the description. And if you have felt anything in the last half hour, that is where the feeling turns into something you can actually hold. So here is the history, handed back to you the way it was always meant to be carried. They measured out just enough to keep you working and never enough to let you stand. And your people answered by growing and catching and foraging and putting up the rest, and the freedom was always in the knowing, never in the ration they handed down. They tried to control whether you could feed yourself at all, and they lost. Now, I want to hear from you, because your family is part of this record too, and the record is only as alive as the people who keep telling it. Tell me in the comments, what did your family grow, or catch, or put up that the store never touched? The garden greens out back, the smokehouse your granddaddy tended, the fish somebody pulled from the water before the sun was even up. Say their names and say what they grew, because that is how the knowing stays above ground. And when you are done, go watch the next one, because this table has more on it than we could set out today. The African crop still growing in southern gardens right now that most people have no idea crossed an ocean to get there. Because the seeds that fed a people in bondage are still in the ground, still coming up every spring, and they have a story of their own that almost nobody is telling. I will see you there.